The silence in my house had a sound. It was the low hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick of the grandfather clock in the foyer, the whisper of the air conditioning kicking on. It was a sound that had become the soundtrack to my life, the space between my husband Mark's brief, staticky phone calls from whatever hotel he was in that week. "Everything good?" he'd ask, his voice already halfway to the next meeting. "Everything's fine," I'd reply, staring at my reflection in the polished black granite of the kitchen island. A woman with neatly styled hair, a sensible cashmere sweater, and eyes that looked a little lost. Our house was beautiful. Mark had made sure of that. It was all clean lines, neutral colors, and strategically placed art that was supposed to convey a sense of calm sophistication. But to me, it felt like a museum exhibit of a life, not a life itself. The halls echoed with my footsteps, each one a reminder that I was the sole occupant of this quiet, perfect space. It was Sarah who first suggested the pottery class. "You need a hobby, Ella," she'd said over lunch, her voice full of the chipper certainty of a woman whose life was overflowing with PDA meetings and carpool schedules. "Something just for you. You can't just wait around for Mark to come home." I demurred, of course. The thought of walking into a room full of strangers, of having to make small talk, made my stomach clench. The years of being a corporate wife, of standing smilingly by Mark's side at functions, hadn't made me any better at it. It had only taught me how to hide the anxiety better. My life had shrunk down to the grocery store, the gym, and the four immaculate walls of my home. The outside world felt loud and complicated. "I'm not very artistic," I'd offered as an excuse. "It's not about being artistic, it's about getting your hands dirty," she'd insisted. "It's primal. It'll be good for you." She was relentless. For weeks, she'd text me links to the community art center, photos of lopsided, endearing mugs, testimonials from people who had found themselves at the potter's wheel. I think, in the end, I agreed just to make it stop. That, and the fact that the silence in the house was starting to feel less like peace and more like a weight. Maybe, I thought, the noise of other people would be a welcome distraction. Maybe getting my hands dirty was exactly what I needed. The art center smelled of damp earth, turpentine, and something vaguely like wet dog. It was a chaotic, lived-in space, a stark contrast to my own sterile home. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light from the high windows, illuminating shelves crammed with lumpy, colorful creations in various stages of completion. A low hum emanated from a row of potter's wheels, each one occupied by someone who seemed to know exactly what they were doing. My heart hammered against my ribs. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and walk back out to the safety of my polished SUV. I felt like an imposter, a woman in tailored slacks and a silk blouse who had wandered into a place she didn't belong. I clutched my purse strap and scanned the room, my eyes landing on an empty wheel in the far back corner, partially obscured by a tall shelving unit. A perfect hiding spot. The instructor, a wiry woman with clay-dusted glasses, gave a cheerful, rambling introduction that I barely heard. My focus was entirely on keeping my breathing even and my hands from quivering. She demonstrated how to slam a wedge of clay onto the wheelhead, how to wet your hands, how to brace your elbows against your knees. It all looked so fluid, so intuitive when she did it. When it was my turn, the clay felt cold and unyielding in my hands.
It resisted me.
I pressed down, trying to center it as she'd shown, but it just wobbled defiantly, slinging muddy water onto my blouse. The harder I tried to force it into submission, the more grotesquely misshapen it became. It slumped to one side, a pathetic, lopsided lump that felt like a perfect metaphor for my life. A low chuckle came from the wheel next to mine. I glanced over, my cheeks burning. A young woman was watching me, her own hands effortlessly coaxing a graceful cylinder from her clay. She was beautiful, but not in a polished, perfect way. Her dark hair was tied up in a messy knot, with stray curls escaping to frame a face with high cheekbones and a wide, amused mouth. She wore paint-splattered jeans and an old t-shirt, and she radiated a kind of easy confidence that I hadn't felt in a decade. "Having a little trouble there?" she asked, her voice a warm, throaty alto. I could only nod, my embarrassment rendering me mute. She shut off her wheel and wiped her hands on a rag. "It's fighting you," she said, nodding at my sad lump of clay. "You have to persuade it, not wrestle it." And then she was there, standing beside my stool, her presence a sudden, startling warmth in the cool studio air. "Mind if I show you?" she asked, though it wasn't really a question. Before I could form a response, she leaned in, close but not touching, and gestured toward my hands. The clean, sharp scent of citrus and something earthy, like fresh rain, filled the air around me. She guided my wrists gently with her own, her fingers light on my skin as she positioned my palms over the wet clay. "You're holding your breath," she murmured, her voice close to my ear. "Breathe. You have to feel it, not just think about it." I forced myself to exhale, a shaky, audible sound. Her guidance was steady, no unnecessary contact, just a calm, sure presence that grounded me. The low hum of the wheel seemed to vibrate right through me. "Okay," she said softly. "Just relax your hands. Let the clay move with you." I did as she asked, my fingers going limp under her gentle direction. With steady pressure, she guided my hands, her thumbs pressing into the center, her fingers shaping the outside. The clay, which had fought me so stubbornly moments before, responded to her touch instantly. It rose up, thinning into a smooth, even wall, a perfect cylinder taking shape as if by magic. I watched, mesmerized, as this thing of beauty was born under our guided hands. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a counterpoint to the steady whir of the wheel. It was the most connected I'd felt with another person in years, more so than the perfunctory hugs from Mark at the airport. This was a shared act of creation, a silent communication through pressure and movement. When she was done, she slowly pulled back, leaving my hands alone on the finished pot. My skin felt cool where hers had been. "See," she said, her smile genuine, lighting up her entire face. "You just needed a little direction." I looked from the pot, impossibly symmetrical and whole, up to her face. I couldn't find my voice. I felt exposed, as if she hadn't just shaped a piece of clay, but had reached in and touched something deep inside me that had been dormant for a very long time. "I'm Luna," she said, holding out a hand still smudged with gray clay. "Ella," I managed to whisper, placing my unsteady hand in hers. Her grip was firm and warm. The rest of the class passed in a blur. I tried to focus on the instructor's directions for trimming and finishing, but my awareness was entirely consumed by the woman at the next wheel. I could feel the heat of her presence, hear the soft sound of her tool scraping against clay, smell that lingering citrus scent whenever she moved. I didn't dare look at her, afraid she would see the turmoil she had ignited in me. When the class was dismissed, I cleaned my station with frantic efficiency, my only thought to escape into the anonymity of the parking lot. I rinsed my hands, grabbed my purse, and made a beeline for the door, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor. "Hey, Ella, wait up." Her voice cut through the noise of the departing students, and I froze with my hand on the door. I turned slowly. Luna was walking toward me, wiping her hands on her jeans, that easy smile back on her face. "You're a fast learner," she said, her dark eyes crinkling at the corners. "And a fast escape artist. I have to get home," I stammered, the excuse sounding lame even to my own ears. "Right," she said, though her tone suggested she didn't believe me for a second. "Well, I was just going to say, a few of us sometimes grab a drink at the poor house down the street after class. You should come." It wasn't an invitation. It was a casual statement of fact, but the unspoken question hung in the air between us. My social anxiety, my carefully constructed routine, my entire being screamed no. It was too much, too soon. I needed the safety of my quiet, empty house. "Oh, I can't," I said, the refusal automatic. "Thank you, but my husband." I let the sentence trail off, the familiar excuse a shield. Luna's smile didn't falter, but something in her eyes shifted, a flicker of understanding that made me feel transparent. "Another time, then," she said, not pressing the issue. "But hey, let me get your number." In case you have another clay emergency. Her playfulness was disarming. I found myself reciting my number before I had even consciously decided to. She tapped it into her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen for a moment. "Got it," she said, her gaze lifting to meet mine. It was a direct, unwavering look that felt like it was searching for something. "I'll see you next week, Ella." She turned and walked away, disappearing into a laughing group of her friends. I stood there for a long moment, my hand still on the door, the warmth of her presence still lingering in the air. I had come here seeking a distraction from my loneliness, and instead, I had found something far more complicated. I walked to my car feeling not relief, but a strange, unsettling sense of disappointment. The week that followed was both agonizingly long and impossibly short. My home, once a quiet sanctuary, now felt like a waiting room. The silence was no longer just an absence of noise. It was a canvas onto which my mind endlessly replayed the moments from class. The weight of Luna's gentle guidance. The sound of her voice in my ear. The unnerving insight in her eyes. When Wednesday finally arrived, I dressed with more care than I had in years. I told myself it was just because I wanted to feel put together, but I knew it was a lie. I chose a deep blue sweater that brought out the color of my eyes and spent 10 minutes trying to tame my hair. The reflection that stared back at me was still me, but there was a spark of anticipation in her eyes that was entirely new. I walked into the studio with a knot of anxiety and excitement tangled in my stomach. Luna was already there, her back to me, chatting with the instructor. When she turned and saw me, her face broke into that familiar, brilliant smile. "There she is," she said, her voice carrying easily across the room. "Ready for round 2. My carefully prepared plan to be cool and distant evaporated. I felt a blush creep up my neck and could only manage a small smile in return. I took my seat at the corner wheel, and a moment later, she was beside me. It was unspoken, but that was her spot now. Our spot. That night, she didn't guide my hands, but her presence was a constant, humming energy beside me. She kept up a running commentary, a mix of teasing remarks about my technique and funny stories about her day. And through it all, there were the small things. The way her arm would brush against mine when she reached for a tool. The way she'd lean in close to be heard over the noise of the wheels, her hair barely grazing my shoulder. The way she'd catch my eye and hold my gaze for just a second too long. Each instance was small enough to be dismissed as accidental, but they accumulated, building a quiet tension that was more potent than any overt gesture. I found myself acutely aware of the space between us, a space that felt charged and full of unspoken words. This became our ritual. Every Wednesday, I would walk into that studio with a sense of dread and exhilaration. And every Wednesday, Luna would be there, drawing me out of my shell with her easy laughter and her unwavering attention. She learned that I liked to read classic novels. I learned that she was studying landscape architecture and dreamed of designing public parks. We were building a friendship, one casual conversation at a time, but underneath it all, that current of something more hummed, persistent, and undeniable. I was starting to look forward to Wednesdays more than any other day of the week. It was the one day I felt truly seen. A few weeks into the session, our class was scheduled for its first bisque firing. The process involved carefully loading our fragile, bone-dry greenware into the massive electric kiln at the back of the studio. It was a two-person job, requiring one person to hand the pieces to another person who would strategically place them on the heavy ceramic shelves inside the kiln. The instructor asked for volunteers, and before I could even think to protest, Luna raised her hand. "Ella, and I can do it," she announced, giving me a conspiratorial wink. And so I found myself in the warm, cramped space behind the kiln with her. The air here was different, thick with the dry, dusty smell of fired clay and the residual heat from the last firing. The studio lights didn't quite reach this corner, casting everything in a soft, intimate glow. We fell into an easy rhythm. I would pick up a piece from the cart, a lopsided bowl I'd made, a delicate vase she'd thrown, and pass it carefully to Luna, who was half crouched inside the kiln's opening. Careful with that one, she said, her voice slightly muffled, as I handed her a small, intricately carved box she had spent 2 weeks perfecting. She's my masterpiece. It's beautiful, I said, and I meant it. My own pieces were clumsy and amateurish next to hers. Nah, she said, placing it gently on a shelf. It's just practice. The important thing is that you're making something, that you're showing up. She backed out of the kiln and stood up, wiping a dusty hand on her thigh. She was closer than I'd realized. You seem different when you're here, you know? Different how? My voice was barely a whisper. I don't know, she said, her gaze thoughtful as she looked at me. The ambient heat from the kiln seemed to intensify, warming my skin. Happier, maybe. More present. That husband of yours, the one who's always away, does he ever get to see you like this? The question was gentle, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. No one had ever asked me that. No one had ever dared to suggest that my marriage was anything less than the perfect picture Mark and I presented to the world. The idea that Mark was missing out on some essential part of me, a part that was only now beginning to surface, was both terrifying and thrilling. He's very busy, I said, the practiced, automatic defense falling from my lips. Luna didn't press. She just held my gaze, her dark eyes full of a quiet, searching compassion. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the kiln and the silent, unfired potential of our creations, I felt the carefully constructed facade of my life begin to crack.
She saw it.
She saw the loneliness I tried so hard to hide, and she wasn't looking away. That night, the tension that had been simmering between us for weeks finally reached its boiling point. After we finished loading the kiln, we cleaned up our stations in a comfortable silence. The easy chatter of earlier had been replaced by a quiet awareness, a sense of something having shifted in the warm space by the kiln. When class was over, she walked with me to the parking lot. The night air was cool, a welcome relief after the stuffy heat of the studio. The gravel crunched under our feet, the only sound besides the distant hum of traffic. I stopped beside my car, fumbling in my purse for my keys. I didn't know what to say. Thank you for your help tonight felt ridiculously inadequate. Anytime, she said softly. I finally found my keys, their familiar weight a grounding presence in my suddenly unsteady hand. I looked up to say goodnight, but the words died in my throat. She was standing under the amber glow of a parking lot light, and she was looking at me with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. You have a little clay dust, she said, her voice low. Right here. She reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against my cheekbone. Quick, gentle. No lingering touch. I stood frozen, my keys clutched in my hand, my heart hammering against my ribs. And then she leaned in. It was quick, and yet time seemed to slow down. I saw the resolve in her eyes, felt the warmth of her breath on my skin a split second before her lips met mine. It was soft, brief, a quiet question rather than a demand. It tasted of the coffee she always drank and smelled of clay and citrus. It was nothing like Mark's dry, absent-minded pecks. This was real. It was present. My mind went completely blank. All the shoulds and shouldn'ts, all the rules of the life I was living, they all vanished. There was only the shock of her mouth on mine, the cool night air, and the frantic, wild beating of my own heart. The moment lasted only a few seconds. When she pulled back, her eyes searched mine, waiting. And I panicked. The full weight of what had just happened crashed down on me. I was a married woman. I was standing in a parking lot being kissed by another woman. Without a word, I turned, unlocked my car, and scrambled inside. I didn't look at her. I started the engine, the sound roaring to life in the quiet lot, and I pulled away, leaving her standing alone in the amber light. I drove home on autopilot, my lips still carrying the faint memory of her kiss, my carefully ordered world shattered into a million pieces. The house had never felt so empty. I walked through the silent rooms, my hand automatically trailing along the cool marble countertops, the smooth back of a leather chair. But none of it felt real. The only thing that felt real was the ghost of Luna's kiss, a touch I couldn't seem to shake. I went through the motions of my evening routine, changing into pajamas, brushing my teeth, staring at my pale, wide-eyed reflection in the mirror. Who was this person? The woman who had fled in a blind panic from a simple kiss? The woman whose heart was still racing hours later? My phone buzzed on the nightstand. Luna's name flashed on the screen. A single text message. Are you okay? I stared at the words, my thumb hovering over the keypad. What could I possibly say? I'm fine. Except you just turned my entire world upside down? I'm sorry I ran away like a frightened child. In the end, I said nothing. I turned the phone over and tried to will myself to sleep. But sleep offered no escape. My dreams were a chaotic swirl of sensations and images. I was back in the studio, the potter's wheel spinning beneath my hands. But the clay was warm, and it molded itself into shapes that felt familiar yet unnameable. The scent of citrus and damp earth was everywhere. Luna was there, her laughter echoing in the background, but when I turned to find her, she was gone. I was alone in the dark, my hands covered in wet clay, my lips tingling with memory. I woke up with a gasp, the sheets tangled around my legs. The first gray light of dawn was filtering through the blinds. The dream had been more vivid, more real, than anything I had experienced in my waking life for years. It wasn't a nightmare. It was a longing. The realization settled in my chest with a quiet, terrifying weight. I hadn't run away from Luna because I was scared of her. I had run away because, for one brief, terrifying moment in that parking lot, I hadn't wanted her to stop. I had run away from myself, from the part of me that had responded to her with a resounding, undeniable yes. The part of me that had been asleep for a very long time was finally, frighteningly, awake. The days leading up to the next class were a special kind of torment. I replayed the kiss, my flight, and my subsequent silence over and over in my mind. A dozen times I drafted a text to Luna, an apology, an explanation, a simple question, but I deleted every one. What was there to say? I didn't have the words for the chaos she had unleashed inside me. By Wednesday evening, I had convinced myself that the only way forward was to pretend it never happened. I would go to class, be polite but distant, and re-establish the comfortable, safe boundary of acquaintanceship. It was a flimsy plan, but it was the only one I had. I walked into the studio, my nerves stretched taut. Luna was already at her wheel, slowly and methodically wedging a piece of clay. She looked up as I approached, and her usual bright smile was absent. In its place was a quiet, unreadable expression. "Hey," she said, her voice neutral. "Hi," I replied, my own voice thin and reedy. I sat down and began to prepare my own clay, my movements stiff and unnatural. The easy, comfortable atmosphere that had grown between us was gone, replaced by a thick, heavy silence. The silence was worse than an argument. It was a chasm, and I was the one who had created it. She didn't tease me about my technique. She didn't lean over to share a funny comment. She worked with a quiet, intense focus, her eyes fixed on the clay spinning before her. But I could feel her awareness of me. It was a palpable thing, a magnetic pull. I could feel her watching me from the corner of her eye, observing my every nervous gesture. The lack of her attention was more profound than its presence had ever been. I had grown accustomed to being the focus of her energy, of her light. Without it, the studio felt dimmer, and my own loneliness, which I thought had begun to recede, came rushing back in full force. I had wanted to create distance, and I had succeeded. But instead of feeling safe, I felt utterly, miserably alone. I was shaping a pot on the wheel, my hands going through the motions, but my mind was screaming. I had been given a glimpse of something warm and real, and in my fear, I had slammed the door shut. The silence from the wheel next to mine was the sound of that door locking. As class ended, I cleaned my station with a familiar urge to flee. I was rinsing my tools at the deep utility sink when I heard her voice behind me. "Ella." I turned, my heart leaping into my throat. Luna stood there, her hands clean, her expression serious. The ambient noise of the studio seemed to fade away. "Can we get a coffee?" she asked. It wasn't a playful invitation this time. It was a direct, necessary request. I think we need to talk. My mind screamed every possible excuse, but my mouth simply formed the word, okay. We walked the block to the poorhouse, the same place she'd invited me to weeks ago. The silence between us was heavy with unspoken things. We found a small table in a quiet corner, the scent of roasted coffee beans a comforting, neutral ground. She didn't speak until after the waitress had brought our drinks. She wrapped her hands around her mug, her dark eyes fixed on my face. I'm not going to apologize for kissing you, she began, her voice low and steady. But I am sorry if I scared you. That wasn't my intention. I stared down at my own untouched latte, tracing the rim of the cup with my finger. I'm married, I whispered, the words feeling hollow and inadequate. I know, she said gently. I also know what I see. I see a woman who walks around like she's made of glass, who's afraid to take up space. But not in the studio. In the studio, you're different. You're focused. You're creating something. And I wanted to know that person. The one who isn't made of glass. Her perception was so accurate it hurt. She saw the very things I tried so desperately to hide. I overstepped, she continued. I move too fast sometimes. It's a flaw. But I'm not sorry for what I feel. She paused, letting the words settle between us. You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know that it wasn't a game. And I needed to know if you're okay. Her honesty was a physical force, stripping away my defenses. She wasn't asking for a declaration or a decision. She was offering me understanding. She was giving me a choice. I could retreat back into the safe, silent world of my marriage, or I could take a single, terrifying step toward this person who saw me more clearly than anyone had in years. I finally lifted my gaze from my cup and met her eyes. I don't know what I'm doing, I admitted, the confession a huge relief. A small, sad smile touched her lips. Join the club, she said softly. None of us do. We're all just making it up as we go. The truce we'd reached at the coffee shop didn't solve anything, but it did change the air between us. The crushing silence was gone, replaced by a fragile, tentative understanding. When I saw her in class the next week, she gave me a small, genuine smile, and I was able to return it without feeling the urge to run. A few days later, Mark called. His voice, tinny and distant through the phone, was coming from a conference room in Tokyo. It was morning there, evening for me. We were literally worlds apart. How are things? He asked, the perfunctory question he always started with. Fine, I said, looking out the kitchen window at the perfectly manicured lawn. The hydrangeas are blooming. That's nice, honey. There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling on his end. He wasn't really listening. He was multitasking, fitting me into a spare 5 minutes between presentations. Listen, it looks like this trip is going to be extended. They want me to swing by the Singapore office on the way back. I'll probably be home in 3 weeks instead of 1. I felt nothing. No disappointment, no anger. Just a quiet, hollow acceptance. This was our life. An endless series of extended trips and delayed homecomings. Okay, I said. Be safe. Always am, he said cheerfully, already mentally checked out of the conversation. Love you. You too, I replied, but the words felt like a foreign language in my mouth. After we hung up, I stood at the window for a long time. I thought about my conversation with Luna in the coffee shop. She had sat across from me, her entire focus on my face, listening to every word, every hesitation. She had seen my fear and hadn't run from it. Mark, my husband of 6 years, had just told me he would be gone for nearly a month, and he hadn't detected a single thing in my voice. He didn't know about the pottery class. He didn't know I was learning to make things with my own hands. He didn't know about the woman with the warm smile and perceptive eyes who had kissed me in a parking lot. He didn't know me. The realization was not a sudden, dramatic lightning strike. It was a slow, cold dawn. The chasm between Mark and me wasn't just geographical, it was an emotional ocean, vast and likely uncrossable. For the first time, I wasn't sad about it. I was just aware. And in that awareness, a small, dangerous seed of possibility began to take root. Let's get out of the studio, Luna texted me one afternoon. Let's see what you look like in the sunshine. The invitation sent a thrill of fear and excitement through me. This was different. This wasn't the semi-anonymous space of the art center or a quick, tense coffee. This was a deliberate choice to spend time together, out in the world. This was a date. My thumb hovered over the screen before I typed back a simple, okay. We met at a large public park, one she told me had been designed by a famous landscape architect she admired. The afternoon sun was warm, filtering through the leaves of the tall oak trees. I felt self-conscious in my jeans and simple t-shirt, so used to the armor of my housewife wardrobe. Luna, dressed in her usual comfortable, carefree style, looked completely at ease. Tell me about this place, I said, needing to fill the silence. And she did. She pointed out the way the paths were designed to lead the eye towards specific vistas, the careful selection of native plants, the way a stone wall was built to look like it had always been there. She spoke with a passion and knowledge that was captivating. She wasn't just looking at a park, she was reading a story written in trees and stone. As we walked, the initial awkwardness began to melt away. We talked about books, about terrible summer jobs we'd had, about the places we'd traveled. I found myself telling her about growing up in a small town, a detail of my life Mark had long since forgotten. She listened, her head tilted, asking questions that showed she was actually hearing my answers. I felt a part of myself unfurling, a part that had been tightly coiled for years. I was laughing, a real, unforced laugh that felt unfamiliar in my own throat. We stopped by a quiet pond, watching the ducks glide across the water. The silence that fell between us now was not the tense, heavy silence of the studio, but a comfortable, peaceful one. You have a beautiful laugh, she said quietly, not looking at me, but at the water. My breath hitched. No one's ever told me that. Then they haven't been listening, she replied. She turned to look at me then, her expression soft. And in that moment, all my fear, all my hesitation, seemed to fall away. This feeling, this easy connection, was more real than anything in my life. I had been starving, and I hadn't even known it. Without thinking, I reached out, and my fingers brushed against hers. She didn't flinch. Instead, she slowly uncurled her hand and laced her fingers through mine. Her hand was warm and strong, and it fit perfectly. We stood there for a long time, side by side, our hands joined, saying nothing at all. It was more profound, more of a commitment, than the kiss had been. It was a quiet, mutual surrender. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, she leaned in and pressed a gentle kiss to my forehead. It was soft, chaste, a silent promise. I closed my eyes, letting the moment wash over me. For the first time in years, I felt at peace. The next Wednesday, I walked into the studio feeling like a different person. The world looked sharper, the colors more vibrant. The change was internal, a seismic shift that had settled into a quiet hum of certainty. Holding Luna's hand in the park and feeling her kiss on my forehead had not broken me, it had pieced me together. It was glazing week. Our bisque-fired pieces were out of the kiln, their forms now hard and permanent. They were a pale, chalky white, waiting for color. I picked up the first pot I had made with Luna's guidance. It was still a little lopsided, the rim uneven, but it was solid. It was mine. I chose a deep cobalt blue glaze, the color of a twilight sky. As I brushed the thick, chalky liquid onto the pot, my mind was calm. Each stroke was deliberate. I wasn't just adding color to a piece of ceramic, I was making a final, definitive choice. For years, I had been glazing over the cracks in my own life. I had covered the loneliness with a veneer of domestic perfection, the emotional distance with polite smiles and practiced excuses. I had tried to make my marriage look like a flawless, finished piece, all the while ignoring the fundamental flaws in its structure. Luna didn't try to glaze over my cracks. She had seen them from the very beginning. She had seen the lopsided, struggling person I was and had offered not to fix me, but simply to stand beside me and help me find my own center. She didn't want the perfect, polished wife of Mark Daniels. She wanted Ella, The Ella who made clumsy pots and had a laugh she'd forgotten she possessed. I looked across the table at her. She was concentrating, her tongue caught between her teeth as she painted a delicate pattern onto one of her vases. A wave of affection, so powerful it almost buckled my knees, washed over me. It wasn't just attraction anymore. It was a deep, resonant feeling of coming home. I finished my pot, the cobalt glaze smooth and even. I looked at my imperfect, beautiful creation, and I knew what I had to do. It was time to stop pretending. It was time to stop covering up the cracks and either let the whole thing shatter or build something new, something honest from the pieces. My life, just like this pot, was in my hands. I went home that night and walked through the silent, perfect house. It was beautiful, but it was a stranger's house. It was Mark's vision, decorated with my compliance. None of it was me. The real me was covered in clay dust and smelled faintly of cobalt glaze. I sat on the edge of our king-sized bed, the bed I had slept in alone for more nights than I could count, and I picked up the phone. I didn't have to look up the international code for Singapore. It was practically memorized. He answered on the second ring, his voice brisk and professional. Daniels. Mark, it's me, I said. Ella. Hey, is everything okay? It's the middle of a workday here. My heart was beating a steady, calm rhythm. The panic I had anticipated was nowhere to be found. Everything is fine, I said, my voice even. I just needed to tell you something. I could hear the impatience in his silence. I was an interruption to his schedule. I don't think you should come home, I said. What? What are you talking about? Is there a problem with the house? No, I said. Not to the house. To us. I'm talking about us. I took a breath. Mark, I want a divorce. The line went silent for a long moment. I could picture him perfectly, standing in a glass-walled office high above the city, loosening his tie, completely blindsided. Is this a joke? He finally asked, his voice tight with disbelief. Is there someone else? The question hung in the air. The honest answer was yes. But the someone else wasn't just Luna. It was me, the person I was becoming. In a way, I said, my voice clear and without a tremor. I'm not happy, Mark. I haven't been for a very long time. And I'm done pretending. It wasn't a fight. There was no yelling, no crying. But Mark's anger flared then, sharp and unexpected. Are you out of your mind? After 6 years of building this life, this perfect life, you're throwing it all away for some hobby? Some stranger. His words cut, but they didn't hurt. They just confirmed what I already knew. He had never seen me at all. The conversation didn't last long after that. He was stunned, angry, confused. He promised to call back later, to fly home immediately. But I knew it wouldn't change anything. I had already made my choice. When I hung up, a profound sense of peace settled over me. I wasn't destroying a life. I was finally claiming one. A month later, the house was full of boxes. The sound of tape being pulled from a dispenser had replaced the oppressive silence. Packing up 6 years of a shared life should have been painful, but instead, it felt like an excavation. With each object I wrapped in paper. Wedding gifts we never used, souvenirs from trips I barely remembered, the crystal vase we'd received as a present and never unwrapped. I felt lighter, as if I were shedding a skin that had grown too tight. I hadn't told Luna about the divorce right away. I needed to do it for myself, not for her. When I finally did tell her, over coffee a few days after the call, she had simply reached across the table and taken my hand. She didn't celebrate or say, I told you so. She just looked at me, her eyes full of a deep, quiet understanding, and said, What do you need? Now, she was here, leaning against the doorframe of the living room, watching me tape up the last box of books. She wasn't helping, just being present, a calm, steady anchor in the chaos of my dismantled life. My new apartment was small, a little shabby, and entirely mine. It was a blank canvas. That's the last of it, I said, wiping a dusty hand on my jeans. I looked around the room, at the empty spaces on the walls where art had once hung, at the faint outlines in the carpet where furniture had stood for years. It wasn't sad. It was just empty, full of potential. I walked over to where Luna stood. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know what our future would look like, or if we even had one. All I knew was that with her, I felt more myself than I ever had with anyone else. The fear was still there, a low hum in the background, but for the first time in my life, it was eclipsed by hope. She looked at me, her gaze taking in the boxes, the empty room, the new, uncertain woman standing before her. A soft smile touched her lips. "Ready?" she asked. The question was simple, but it held the weight of everything. Ready to leave this life behind? Ready to start over? Ready for whatever came next? I looked at her, at the open door behind her leading out into the bright, unknown afternoon, and I felt a sense of peace settle deep in my bones. "Yes," I said. "I am."